Well, I'd always known it was nonsense. Well, don't say that always known. When I was at medical school, I was taught like everybody else, if you eat too much fat, saturated fat, it raises your blood cholesterol, which is deposited in the arteries, leading to thickenings called atherosclerosis, and eventually these become so thick that you die. That was it. That was the message. I had no reason to doubt it at the time. If you're going to pass an exam, cholesterol, heart disease. Um, and then, but I live in Scotland, born and bred. And at the time, I was at medical school, which is early 1980s. Scotland had the highest rate of heart disease in the world, um, specifically the west side of Scotland, although I didn't actually live there. And the message was, oh, the terrible Scots diet, and they all eat deep fried Mars bars and stuff like this, which is all complete nonsense, of course. But I was aware, because I went to France quite a lot for various reasons, holidays, skiing, blah, blah, blah. And when you went to France, I looked at, used to look around the restaurants and think, these people seem to eat quite a lot of saturated fat to me. In fact, an awful lot.
Mm.
Slather everything in butter and it's cream and it's meat. And,
I mean,
you
the
can,
French are
at
known
that
for that, right? For their rich
the French,
foods.
and
They're
well,
known
well,
for
in
that.
fact, at that time, if you went to a French restaurant and asked for a vegetarian meal, they just
Mm.
took the meat off the plate and gave you what was left. There was no such thing, and there still is. It's very, anyway. So I started looking at the dietary stuff, and it was clear the French ate more saturated fat than the Scots. Not much more, but a bit more. The cholesterol levels were identical, and the rate of heart disease in Scotland was age matched, 5 times higher, 5 times higher. And in fact, Scottish women had higher rates of heart disease than French men, and women are supposed to be protected against heart disease at certain ages. So I began to think, it's not really working this for me. So then I started going into it in more and more detail, really. And I started thinking, well, so how does saturated fat raise cholesterol? And what is cholesterol in your blood anyway? And
Yeah.
all these things that actually seem to be almost impossible for people to find out. And I gradually just came, I wrote a couple of papers. I wrote a medical hypothesis paper looking at France and Scotland and saying, there's no difference. The rate of smoking, the French smoked a bit more. The rate of obesity at the time was the same, cholesterol level, blood pressure, all the standard risk factors. In fact, the standard risk factors were so close together that I like to joke you can get a cigarette paper between them. But if anything, they were worse for France. So if you took
Mm.
a French series of risk factors and put them into a risk calculator, which didn't exist at the time, and took the Scottish risk factors on general, put them in risk factors, the French would score higher. Either way, they should have more heart disease.
Mm.
And yet they were getting far less and continue to do so. So I started really beginning to look into this and thinking, you know what? And I read a book called Eat Your Heart Out by a doctor called James LaFanu, who's writes for or did write for the Daily Telegraph. And I spoke to him and he basically said the diet part of the hypothesis is bunk.
Mm.
And I started to go into this. It's a bit like the red pill and the blue pill in the Matrix, If you take the blue pill, you carry on and everything's fine. You question nothing. The world makes sense in some weird fashion. You take the red pill and it's like, hold on. So I then began to think, well, if that saturated fat's supposed to raise cholesterol, and cholesterol kills you from heart disease, and this is the primary cause of heart disease, and there is no association between saturated fat consumption and death in any country that I can find, in fact, the exact opposite in many cases, then surely the cholesterol hypothesis must be resting on shaky foundation, should we say? And why don't the blood vessels in your lungs have
Yeah. And
atherosclerosis?
why
None.
not just all along the artery
Yeah.
walls?
And
Like,
why not
why
all
not
along
all
the artery
along?
wall? If it's
Yeah.
absorbing through, why is it only absorbing through in certain points? So you get a plaque. Some people die because of one atherosclerotic plaque
Mm.
in one artery in their heart. They have everything else is clear. One plaque. Right? You say, well, surely that's a problem of that bit of the artery. That can't be a sort of global problem with cholesterol.
Mm.
And of course, if you take a vein from the leg and stick it into the heart and use it as a coronary artery bypass, it very rapidly furs up with atherosclerosis. So there's veins can develop atherosclerosis, and a vein in a person that has no atherosclerosis can be taken from their leg and put into their heart, whereupon it develops atherosclerosis. So you say, well, there's clearly something about it being in the heart that is doing this.
Mm.
And what is that? What is happening here that is not happening there? What's going on? So when you start, and when you say to cardiologists, why don't you get atherosclerosis in veins? They don't answer this question. They just say, oh, it's bad. And you think when someone doesn't have an answer to a question, that you think, I'm going to look at this really, really closely. And I'm going to ask myself, well, why? And then you look at, there are conditions that children have, well, adults have them, but they tend to sort them out, whereby you have shunts in your heart, where there's a fairly large gap in your heart, and the blood pressure from the left side of your heart shoots into the right side of your heart, then goes into your lungs, and then increases the blood pressure in your lungs, called pulmonary hypertension. And if you have this condition, you end up with atherosclerosis in your lungs. So you think, well, what is the difference between somebody who's got this, called Eisenmenger's syndrome? What's the difference between this and not this? Is the level of blood pressure, clearly. What you call the biomechanical stress, or whatever term you want to use. So something's happening to the blood vessel, and that something is clearly the thing that triggers the process, or allows the process to happen. A bit like with a gun, you can't fire it until the safety catch is off. So someone's removed the safety catch if you take a vein and put it in the heart, and someone's removed the safety catch if you got a hole in your heart that allows the blood pressure to go to high pressure in your lungs. And then you can find other things. You look back in history and you say, well, other people have thought this. This is not just me. The first ideas around this started in 1852. So that's 170 years ago. So I didn't wake up one day with a fully formed hypothesis about all this stuff. There's a guy called Karl von Rokitansky, who was in Vienna in 1852. But then you start looking and you say, well, actually, a lot of people have had these same ideas over the years. It's just that it's never, ever reached with critical mass, or whatever term you want to use. So after the Second World War, there were quite a lot of people who were saying, well, we're looking at in the lungs, actually, mainly of people, and saying, well, what we can see, and in other blood vessels, what we see is you see what they call a thrombus, or a blood clot, blocking a blood vessel. And it can fully block a blood vessel, and you think that's pretty disastrous. And then what happens is little pipes of blood vessels start to form and go all the way through this thrombus, and then gradually they form together and become a new tube through which the blood can flow. And then around this you have like a sort of wedding, or some people call it a wedding ring of blockage, a thinning area, so that certain areas have been, if you like, blocked and then hollowed out. And these, as you said, you can see these becoming what we call atherosclerosis. Over time they turn from a blood clot into atherosclerosis. And it was a really interesting research paper from 1955. Unfortunately, if you want to look at research papers from 1955, normally you have to pay about $500 to get access to them. It's ridiculous. The money situation. Anyway, so I was looking at this paper.
I'll get you started.
No, they got me started. And what they'd realized, there'd been research where they got animals and they'd injected blood clots into their veins, and then they'd gone up their vein into their heart, gone through their heart, right side of the heart, and into their lungs, where obviously it gets stuck as the blood vessels get smaller and smaller. And what they found is if you kept injecting blood clots into animal veins in their lungs, they developed atherosclerosis, what was called atherosclerosis. It started off with blood clots. The blood clots gradually transformed, and they turned into plaques, atherosclerotic plaques, which is the underlying heart disease thing. And so they said, well, does this happen in children? And in 1955, they didn't have heart-lung transplant machines. There were children who had heart problems and valve problems that they couldn't operate on, but they were firing blood clots into their lungs on a regular basis. And what they saw is that these blood clots were coming off the heart, getting into the lungs, blocking in the lungs, and turning into atherosclerotic plaques, or what you would say is an atherosclerotic plaque. So you can see all the sort of mechanism. Here's a blood clot, it gets jammed into a blood vessel, and then it turns into a plaque. Now, obviously, that isn't quite happening in the rest of your body, potentially, or maybe it is happening in the rest of your body. So you start thinking, well, blood clots can become plaques. We can see that from start to finish. The process is there. You can make them happen by injecting blood clots into animals. You can see children who have no other reason to have atherosclerosis developing atherosclerosis. And then other people did research more recently showing that people who have Eisenmenger syndrome and who create clots in their heart, these will end up in the lungs and they will turn into atherosclerosis. So you have the whole process here, and you think, well, why has this not been taken up? And in fact, I was taught, I never realized it at the time, I was taught by Elspeth Smith, who was a cardiovascular researcher. She said at one point to me, in sort of retrospect, she said, LDL, which is what we call cholesterol, LDL, low density lipoprotein, we call it cholesterol, it's just nonsense, cannot get through the endothelium, which is the lining of all blood vessels. Mm-hmm. It is unable to pass through the endothelium. And this kind of comment, and this was in a small group tutorial, I remember thinking, she said that it meant really something that was really significant. I don't quite understand why it was significant. I didn't know what LDL was, and I didn't know what endothelium was. I then started reading some of her stuff, and she made, what she said was, and this is in 1980 something, that atherosclerosis is basically due to blood clotting, and from start to finish, it is blood clotting all the way through, start to finish. She said this. She should have a Nobel Prize. She's dead, so she won't. And there have been other researchers. Ronald Ross was called response to injury hypothesis. What he said was that if the endothelium, the lining of your blood vessels, becomes damaged or disrupted in some way, that at that point a blood clot forms on that area, because obviously the body thinks that if a blood vessel is damaged, it needs that blood, that may mean I'm about to be bleeding to death. So I have to block that very quickly. Because normally a blood vessel will be damaged, somebody sticks a knife in you, or a tiger sticks a claw in you, or whatever. So you have to stop that bleeding very, very quickly, especially in arteries which have much higher blood pressure. So you have to have a system whereby blood clots form really quickly, and they have to be really difficult to sort of remove. Otherwise, there's no point in them. So if you damage the lining of a blood vessel, there's a substance in your blood vessel. It's called tissue factor, which you ask 100 doctors, none of them have heard of it. Anyway, it's like Instaclot. You'll all have heard of factor 8 and factor 7 and factor 9 and factor 10 and all these things. That's a slow clotting system. That's the intrinsic system. The extrinsic system is clot now, here, now, instantly. So when you disrupt the endothelium, a blood clot will form at that point. Bang, stick to that point, and it will form. It will be quite big to start with. It will get shaved down, but it will still be there, stuck to the blood vessel wall. It's called a mural thrombus. That's the term for it. And then you ask another question: well, what happens to it then? Because if that blood vessel that's sticking to the side of an artery was to break off and travel down the artery, it could cause a stroke or a heart attack further down the artery, or damage to other organs. All sorts of nasty things can happen. So clearly, it cannot be allowed to break off. So it's stuck onto the artery wall, however big it may be. What do you do with it? Well, if you scratch your skin, you get a scab, and the scab falls off because the skin grows up from underneath and pushes it off, really. Well, that doesn't happen in your blood vessels because the lining, the endothelium, is only one layer thick, and it cannot come from underneath because there's no underneath. And it can't come from the sides because once an endothelial cell is what they call mature, it can't replicate itself. It's stuck. And so a lot of people have been struggle with this for a while. Where does the new endothelium come from? Where is it from? And they realized in about the mid-1990s, it comes from within your bone marrow. It's made in blood. It's made by stem cells. It's called endothelial progenitor cells. They float around in your bloodstream, and if they find an area of damage, they stick onto it, and then they grow and they form a new layer of endothelium over the top of the blood clot that's sitting there. So the blood clot is now within your artery wall. And this is a thing that, of course, they didn't know originally, which is why Rokitansky in 1852 couldn't answer the question, how can your blood clot be underneath the endothelium? Because blood clots form in the bloodstream. They don't form outside the bloodstream. And he couldn't answer that question. But you could answer it now, which is, well, actually you get the damage, you get the blood clot, and then the endothelium grows on top of it, reforms, and the blood clot is drawn into the artery wall. Now, we know all these things happen.
Yeah.
This is not in any, none of what I am saying is, by the way, will it be contentious when you bring it all together as this is how it happens, but each part of it is not contentious.
Yeah.
We know, because they've looked at people who've got angina and blockages in their arteries in their heart, and they scan them every year just to see what progress is happening. And what they found is you don't get a gradual thickening of the clot or the plaque. What happens is 1 year it's this size and next year it's this size. So it jumps in size. And as they've said, this can only because what has happening is a new blood clots are formed on that area and it's added itself to the underlying plaque. That's how plaques grow. That's not contentious. And the final thing that kills you is a blood clot on top of an already existing plaque. Because at that areas are a bit narrower, the endothelium is a bit more, has more been damaged, and the blood flow at that point is turbulent.
It's getting worse and worse over time.
This becomes, it becomes the focus, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So this becomes a focus for blood clotting at that point. Now that's not contentious. The fact that it's a blood clot in the end that clots on top of a previous existing plaque and fully blocks an artery and causes a heart attack or a stroke, that's not contentious. So none of that is contentious. Mainstream medicine will not have any problem if you say these things to them. Where they have a problem is you say, that's also how it starts. At that point, they go, no, it starts because low density lipoprotein is absorbed through the endothelium, which cannot happen, into the artery wall behind, which starts the plaque in the first place. The thinking started because basically they found they found cholesterol in plaques in quite high concentration. They didn't know there was such a thing as an LDL at that time, but then they said, well, where can this have come from? Well, the only place it could have come from is the bloodstream, and that was about as scientific as it got. And it is true that you can find LDL. Well, actually, the question is it true you can find an LDL particle in a blood clot? Because another issue that, again, 99.9% of doctors are blissfully unaware of is that there's, step back, LDL is a low density lipoprotein, right? It carries within it cholesterol and fats. The cholesterol and the fats are linked together, and when you link a cholesterol and a fat, you get a thing called a cholesterol. So cholesterol, LDL carries cholesterol esters around in the bloodstream. Now, LDLs are not made anywhere, but they are what the thing that turns into an LDL is made in the liver. It's called a very low density lipoprotein, VLDL. You may have heard of that called a triglyceride, which is insane because it's not a triglyceride. It's a bit like calling a car a human being because cars contain human beings. LDL is not cholesterol. It is a vehicle which transports cholesterol and fats around the bloodstream because cholesterol and fat are not soluble in blood, so they have to be put into a water-soluble sphere called a lipoprotein. Now, the liver makes VLDLs, it synthesizes them, and it sends them out into the bloodstream. And as they travel around the body, they lose the fat, and they become higher and higher in concentration of cholesterol. So they have, so say it's 50-50 fat cholesterol. By the time they become an LDL, it's 80-20. So nothing is new under the world. Anyway, so an LDL is, if an LDL was the size of a human being, a cell would be about the size of a major sports stadium, just to give you some example of the scale, about Wembley or something, or the Super Bowl or wherever it is. And so they carry around, and in fact, they can't directly get into cells because cells don't let things in unless they want them in. So the cell produces a receptor for LDL that sticks. It doesn't actually stick out the cell wall. Anyway, it's in the cell wall. The LDL comes along, locks onto it, and the whole thing gets dragged into the cell. And that is how LDL gets into a cell. So the receptor is required. All right. So when you're saying to someone, well, okay, then, so how does LDL get through the endothelial cell from the bloodstream to the artery wall? Because the cell would have to absorb it, take it into the cell, travel it across the cell, be a bit like walking all the way across Wembley Stadium, turning itself inside out the other side and popping the LDL out into the artery wall. Now there is a system that allows molecules to be transported across cells, which is incredibly clever. I always find to think this is all amazingly clever. It's called transcytosis. The transcytosis doesn't work for LDL. So the only way you could get it would be between the endothelial cells. And you say, well, maybe it slips through the gap. And you go, well, I've got news for you, because when cells are next to each other, they link very tightly together. And then they have about 5,000 protein strands stuck. And that it's a bit like saying you could get between two terraced houses. No, you can't. Although they are two separate houses, they are actually linked together by bricks all the way through.
Yeah, so it's not
possible. So that we call tight junctions. And tight junctions are required for life. If these tight junctions didn't exist, if anything in the bloodstream could just go straight through, past the endothelium and into the tissues and organs behind, you would be dead like that.
Right.
And we know you would be dead because there is a disease where that happens, and that's called Ebola.
Right.
And the Ebola virus, for whatever reason, it opens up tight junctions between endothelial cells and allows everything to escape. That's why it's called hemorrhagic fever, and your eyeballs go bloody and things go bloody, because your entire body disintegrates at that point. That's how it kills you. And it kills you because it opens up tight junctions. So we know that if tight junctions are not tight, you die.
Yes, yes.
And yet the argument is, oh, well, the LDL goes between cells through these tight junctions where there is no junction. These tight junctions stop single ions, which would be like the size of a grain of sand next to a human being.
Yeah.
So it can control the passage of a grain of sand, yet it can't control the passage of a human being. Though this is clearly nonsensical.
Yeah.
It just absolutely makes no sense. So people say, oh, well, the junctions open up. And you go, well, I can believe if you've damaged the junction, if you've damaged endothelial cells, the junctions will open up, but then everything can get through.
Yeah.
Red blood cells, white blood cells, water, albumin, you name it, it's through. It's rushing through, and everything will go through. All right.
Yeah.
So why just LDL? Why is it specifically one molecule, a very large molecule, a huge molecule? Why is it this one that can go through and nothing else? The other thing that people don't know is that all blood vessels are supplied, large blood vessels are supplied by their own blood vessels called vasa vasorum, the blood vessels of the blood vessels.
Wow, I did not know that. Yeah.
And in your big arteries, the arteries that get atherosclerosis sized, little blood vessels form a lattice work around the blood vessel, and they go into the blood vessel and they move all the way around in the blood vessel to provide it with the nutrients it needs, otherwise it would die. And the interesting thing is that whilst I've talked about this barrier function, once blood vessels get very small, the barrier function starts to break down, as it has to, because in very small blood vessels in your kidneys, for example, if the waste products couldn't leak out and into the nephron and all that, kidneys couldn't work. All that would happen is the blood would go into the kidney and come out of the kidney, and nothing would have happened.
Yeah.
So when very small blood vessels, they have things called fenestrations, which fenestra, a window, they've got holes in them, and the basement underlying them opens up, so things can move in and out of very small blood vessels. So all arteries and all veins, there's more vasa vasorum in veins, are filled with vasa vasorum, from which all sorts of things can leak in and out, including, of course, LDL. So actually, why doesn't the LDL leak out from behind, if you like, into the artery wall? And if it's doing that, why doesn't it do in the vein wall?
Yeah.
And again, if you asked 100 doctors, have they heard of the vasa vasorum? 99.9 would never have heard of this stuff. And when they were doing this research originally, when the hypothesis existed, they didn't know there was vasa vasorum. They didn't know there was LDL. They didn't know there were tight junctions. They'd never heard of transcytosis. They didn't know there were endothelial progenitor cells. They never heard of nitric oxide. It's just like, well, yeah, all that stuff, but it's still the same thing. They didn't even heard. There's another thing that no one's ever heard of, it's called the glycocalyx, which is a gigantically important physiological structure in your body. As I say, if you try and pick up a fish, most fish, not sharks, you try and pick up a fish, it slips between your fingers. It slips between your fingers because it's covered in a thing called glycocalyx, which is 1,000 times slippier than Teflon, right? And it's made up of little strands of protein and sugar. It's called glycoproteins, and it's a little wavy forest. and it's designed to protect the underlying endothelium from things banging into it. It's also incredibly anticoagulant, so everything can smoothly move over it. And inside it, there's all sorts of hormones and enzymes. It's just a gigantically complicated thing.